So, welcome back to this third part. You're doing well to have stayed with us if you've been part of all three of these webinars so far. Maybe we need a prize to see if anyone can get to all six, Jacob, at the end. I'm not quite sure what that would be. Anyway, so this week, again, we take a bit of a different turn. So now we're considering the question of the relationship between religion and the rise of capitalism. And that's actually the title of a book that we'll have a little look into tonight. But essentially the question, is Christianity implicated in the rise of capitalism? But before we get into that subject matter, just a quick recap on where we are in the series. So third part. And next week we'll get on to next session, we'll get on to talking around the social and economic outcomes and effects of capitalism in the world and how we think about those. Has it been a good thing in relation to things like poverty and inequality, or a bad thing? And then in the last two sessions, we'll be asking questions about how we live in capitalism, and really how we think about being in the midst of capitalism as Christians, how we live and act, and then what we can think about. Are there any alternatives? And if so, how do we get there? Okay, so just to briefly recap, I think it's worth repeating these things because I think these are quite counterintuitive for many people, and it's something I think there's a lot of difficulty with. Being clear about what we mean by capitalism. So what is it? So what it is not, in the way that I'm talking about capitalism, is not merely a synonym for commerce, business, trade, profit making, and not even a synonym for the market economy. You can have all of these things that commerce, business, profit, and market economies that don't show capitalist dynamics. Neither is it, contrary to Marx's definition, Karl Marx's definition of capitalism, I don't mean simply a mode of production, or basically the industrial system. And also by capitalism, I don't mean some free market economic ideology such as neoliberalism. They come later. Economic ideologies justifying capitalism come along, but they shouldn't be confused with the thing itself. What is capitalism? So we've been saying capitalism is really just, it's a construct. It's something that we use to describe something big and momentous in history. It's a way of naming something we can see in history. Historians have lots of these constructs: feudalism, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment. These are all historiographical constructs that we use to name big things that we can sort of see happening. And capitalism is just one of those. It's something that describes the behavior of individuals or firms, or sometimes even nations. It can be used to describe all of those things. But I've argued it really comes into its own when we use it to describe an economic system, or what I've called a world system. So capitalism as an economic system is defined by these two core elements, which make it differ from other social economic systems we've seen in history. It is driven, it has an imperative for endless accumulation. As a system, it needs to do this. If it stops doing it, then the system is in danger of failing. And it's also, it does that through the process of relentless commodification, bringing everything, all of life, into the realm of the market for so that profit can be made in those areas. A capitalist interstate economic system, that's what I mean by a world system. It's something that's more than just one country, involves a series of countries all together. A capitalist interstate economic system began in Europe in, I'm calling it the long 16th century. That's really between 1450 to 1650. and expanded to displace all other world systems by the mid-19th century. So in the world we live in today, there's only one world system, and that's a capitalist world system. Last week, when we talked about really a theological way of thinking about capitalism, we noticed that the capitalist world system behaves rather like the thing that we call the powers that is described in the New Testament, the principalities and powers, particularly in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. That is, it's an unseen governing force of human affairs, and an oppressive one at that. Two, it's also something that shapes human perceptions of reality, distorts human perceptions of reality. And thirdly, it's because of these two things and others of its characteristics that we've discussed in the previous two sessions, it's something that is in direct opposition to God. And that is how the fallen powers are thought about in the New Testament. So with that last statement in mind, it's sort of quite alarming or surprising that the next question, and the question of our session today, is did Christianity cause capitalism? Which is quite an alarming question if you take seriously the statement I said before, that it's something that is in direct opposition to God or the Christian gospel. And so really the things driving that question is these two basic facts, is that a capitalist world system came into being in Christian Europe. That's where it arose out of historically. Two, it also formed around about the time of the Protestant Reformation. So Martin Luther nailed his thesis, his 90 theses to the door in Wittenberg in 1517, I think it was. So that's right smack bang in the middle of the period we're talking about. Is there a link between all of these, between these things? And the fact that it happened in Europe and then expanded to Christian Europe, expanded to take over the world, does that was Christianity a part of a cause of that, or is that incidental to what happened? So that's our subject for tonight. But before we get there, it's worth just spending a little bit of time clarifying something I don't think I've really clarified properly yet. And that's this question, is capitalism peculiar only to Europe? That is it Europe the only place that we can see capitalism ever arising in history? And the answer is simply no. So we can see individuals and firms, so that's particular people or particular organizations. I'm going to call them firms because companies is a bit, they organize differently, but in various ways. But individuals and firms exhibiting capitalist behavior, not Catholic behavior, can be found in ancient Rome, if you look hard enough, certainly in medieval Islam, in Ashikaga, Japan, that's of the 16th century, in Mughal India, and within the Chinese diaspora, particularly during the Qing dynasty. So the Chinese diaspora is those Chinese trading networks, particularly through Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, which weren't under the control of the emperor. So in all these places, we can find people exhibiting both the drive to endless accumulation and commodification, who are seeking profit, more profit, reinvesting profit in very intensive and rational ways. We're going to talk about that tonight. That basically describes capitalism. And you can see on the left-hand picture on the side there, there's a picture of markets within medieval Islam, and medieval Islam had very developed both markets, trade, and finance. And on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of the Jagat Set, the head of the Jagat Set household in 17th century Mughal India. And they were basically a banking firm based in Bengal, but with tentacles extending all the way to the Mediterranean and all the way out to the South China Sea. Some people think that in the 18th century, the Jagat set, the head of the Jagat set was perhaps the wealthiest man on the planet. So they certainly knew all about capitalism. But within all of these places, you could only find it within certain firms or individuals. Never did you see an economic system actually begin to develop capitalist dynamics. It was only in Europe that an economic system itself began to exhibit capitalist dynamics, where it began to emerge. And it's worth noting that a number of the techniques in European capitalism were learnt through medieval Islam, and some of them ultimately from India, but transmitted through Islam. So they weren't necessarily the first to some of the core techniques of particularly financial capitalism. All right, so capitalism is not the only place that we see capitalism. Sorry. Start again. Europe is not the only place that we see capitalism arising in history, but it's the only place where the economic system takes on a capitalist dynamic. Why is that so? And did Christianity have anything to do with that? So we're going to have a look at a couple of key thinkers tonight on this subject. And the first one who has to be talked about is Max Weber, considered one of the founding fathers of sociology, along with Marx and Durkheim. And his famous treatise, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which he published in 1904, it's probably one of the most influential texts of the 20th century, had a huge impact, both for the way he went about his work and also the thesis. And his, so a lot of people have, it's one of those bits of literature that lots of people think they know about, never read, but and basically a lot of people think the caricatured version is that Max Weber is blaming the Protestant Reformation for starting capitalism. And blaming would be the right word, because Max Weber didn't like capitalism, and he was looking for a cause, but we're going to see that actually the idea that Weber blames capitalism on Christianity is not quite correct. Certainly not quite what Weber intended to say. But actually, you find that's a very widely held understanding out there. Lots of people are certain that's what Max Weber said. And you'll even hear, I've heard people spout a version of Weber's thesis that the Protestant Reformation caused capitalism, and not even have heard of Max Weber. So the story has sort of got loose, and it's out there, and it's seen as just one of those received bits of knowledge. Actually, Weber's thesis is a lot more sophisticated than that. And as you'll see, although I ultimately disagree with it, it's got a lot of fine work in it, and it's actually a really interesting read. So Weber was interested in what he was trying to do in this text was he's interested in the influence of certain religious ideas on the development of an economic spirit, or what he called the ethos of an economic system. And in German, the word ethos, ethic, is quite close to that word spirit, Geist, as well in its meaning. So really what he's interested in the ethics or the ethos of an economic system, and how that's shaped by religious ideas. And he took that, he didn't just ask that in the case of capitalism Europe. He took that same project and he asked the same questions in Confucian China and Hindu India later. This was his great sociological project. So that's what he's interested in. And essentially, one of the things that Weber is doing is countering Karl Marx's materialist explanation of history. So Karl Marx famously said that all history is a history of class warfare. And basically he sees, really economic factors driving all of history, and ideas are just the sort of fluff that happens around the core underlying economic drivers of history. Weber wants to say no, ideas are important, and what happens in culture and society is important. So his version is sometimes labeled an idealist explanation of history. So that's part of what he's doing too. And what Weber was really interested in this essay is addressing the rise of what he calls capitalist rationality in Christian Europe. So not just the idea that some people behave to accumulate profit in an endless cycle, which he well understood. You can find all over in all sorts of places throughout history. Lots of people exhibit that behavior. However, when you begin to see a culture and a society operating to a capitalist rationality, then we have something quite new in history. And that's what interested Weber, is how did that come about? And he, along with many other people, noticed that the drivers of world capitalism, as he had seen it, had been overwhelmingly Protestant. The Dutch, the English, and then the Americans, Protestant nations. And he got to wondering what Protestantism in particular might have, that might be the link there with capitalism. And so he started looking at the Reformation. Now, he wasn't particularly interested in how Protestants talked about economic ethics. He actually didn't think that was that important. But rather, Weber was more interested in, and this was one of the things he lent to the field of sociology, was how what he called the subconscious psychological sanctions of someone's religious faith influence their behavior. That is how the structure of their faith influenced them to behave in some ways and not other ways, in ways that they may not really realize that their faith is driving them towards those things. And you'll see how that comes out in a moment. Ultimately, Weber's thesis is that capitalist rationality was an unintended consequence of the Reformation. He certainly doesn't think that either Luther or Calvin were pro-capitalist, and we'll see more on that at the moment, but it was something that happened anyway, basically because of these subconscious psychological sanctions from the faith, the structure of faith that they started through the Reformation. Now, he does see this as being one of the causes of capitalism, but only one of the causes. He talks about it as one side of the causal chain. Weber is well aware of the economic factors in economic history driving, and his list of those is not unlike the list that I posted in the first session of this series. So he knew his economic history very well. He doesn't have a simplistic argument saying that it was just a religious cause, but he's interested in the role that religion contributed to it and seeing it as a cause. So looking at Luther, Weber notices the importance of Luther. So this is Martin Luther in the early 1500s and his secularization of the idea of calling. So up until this point in Catholic Christian Europe, the idea of calling was restricted to those entering monastic orders. You had a calling. If you entered, you became a monk, or I guess a nun as well. I'm not entirely sure whether it was the same language. What Luther did, and the big, I guess, the revolution of his Reformation was to secularize the idea and say that everyone's got a calling. So all people in their various different places in work and society have a calling. And this gave a moral justification to worldly activity. So that said something really big, and that was so that was one way of Luther removing the power that centered around the priesthood and the bishops and the monastic movement in the Catholic world. So under Calvinism, this took on extra steam. So for Luther, the idea of calling was really, Luther was quite conservative, and it really functioned to sort of bolster the status quo. So, for Luther, if you were a peasant, well, you were called to be a peasant. Hurrah! You should serve your Lord with joy and happiness, because that's your calling. Whereas in Calvinism, which was a much more urbanized took place within urban Europe and in much more commercial settings, the idea of calling took on different steam. And so particularly devotion to one's worldly calling, if you were a merchant, for example, made you much more likely, or an artisan, made you much likely to make more money if you were exerting a lot more energy into this thing that you saw as your calling. As alongside of that, Weber noticed that particularly within Calvinism and the Reform movement, there could be a pretty dour sort of asceticism. So that's this idea, just as medieval monks were meant to have renounced luxury and wealth, and so live a very simple life. Within Calvinism, there was also some ideas around asceticism, and particularly the idea that frivolous consumption is sinful. So that's you get those pictures of Dutch Reformed Calvinists wearing all black and looking a bit sad, really. So that sort of very dour image. So the question is, if you're making more money, but you're not really spending it on anything, what are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to reinvest that money back into the worldly enterprise that is your calling, and you're going to redouble your efforts. And so then you're going to make more money. And then what are you going to do with that money? Well, you're going to reinvest it back into your enterprise. And therefore, you see the cycle born of capitalist rationality really taking on steroids within Calvinism. I'm simplifying Weber's thesis here, by the way. He's more sophisticated than that, but that's basically how it operates. As well as that, this is the thing that really put fuel on the fire, is the idea of double predestination within Calvinism. The idea that there was a certain number of elect who were getting to heaven, and that was decided by God at the beginning of time, and there are a group of people, everyone else was predestined to go to hell, essentially. And there was basically nothing you could do about that. So this is where the idea of the sovereignty of God became so big in Calvinism. You couldn't do anything so to earn salvation. You were either elect or you weren't. So Weber considered that must have led many people to worry about their salvation, about whether they were members of the elect or not. And this would lead them to seeking confirmation of their election. And it's well known that people tended to see worldly success as a blessing from God. So that was one of the bits of data that was important. And if you saw that as a blessing from God, well, that must mean surely that then you are part of the elect, and therefore you might sleep a bit more easy. And so here you can see a classic example of one of these subconscious psychological sanctions. It's not something he's saying they thought through like this, but actually the idea of nervousness about your election, when you also have an idea that if you're doing well in the world, then God must be blessing you. Well, that driving you to do well in the world so that you can have a sense of God's blessing and more confidence about your election. That's basically his thesis. And then the final step in that, so that happened within capitalism and within Puritanism in England. But then the final step was the transmission of the ethos that into broader society. And so what you see happening through the processes of education and culture, and he gives a big emphasis to how education takes place in this, is really the distilling of these core ideas that wasting of time is a sin, and efficiency is a real virtue. These are things we need to pay attention to, and these being transmitted into the culture and ultimately becoming the ethos that's enshrined into what becomes a bureaucratic industrial system, which Weber sees becomes something like an iron cage of capitalist rationality, because it becomes enshrined in a culture and a system. Doesn't sort of matter what you believe or what you think about it. There's this system that operates to this rationality, and you just have to conform. And Weber was pretty despairing about it. He could be pretty bleak, actually. And he's sort of saw people trapped in this iron cage of capitalist rationality, even once religious belief had sort of died away. And that's the inheritance he saw of the Protestant Reformation. So what are the problems with that? There are a number. And basically, the consensus these days amongst historians and sociologists is that Weber's thesis is basically wrong. There's not many people who go along with that version of events, even though there's actually a lot of bristling and sparkling insight in his thesis, and it's well worth a read if you ever get the chance. But what was wrong with it? Firstly, is that just on a historical level, we already see, and this is something I mentioned in the first series, a fully fledged version of capitalist rationality amongst the North Italian city-states in the 15th century. So that's before the Protestant Reformation. So, and in fact, these city-states stay Catholic even after the Reformation. So capitalism is well underway and going along with a full head of steam, fully blown capitalism by the 15th century in these Catholic areas. And there on the right is a picture of Lorenzo Medici, something who had nothing to learn from our modern day finance capitalists. He pretty much knew the gamut of techniques and exploited them to their full. So that's one major hole in Weber's thesis. There was plenty of Catholic already states or political entities demonstrating capitalist rationality. Secondly, his description of Calvinism is just too simplistic, and I'll fill that out a little bit more soon. And the clanger is that his version of the ascetic Calvinist merchant who's worried about their election just doesn't really actually seem to be a figure that we can find in history. So he came up with that idea by thinking through what Calvinism did and how it might behave psychologically. He didn't really do it by actually looking through evidence of how people actually were. And there's pretty, it seems pretty clear a lot of the successful capitalist merchants within the Dutch reform world and Puritans, maybe they weren't as frivolous as their Catholic French counterparts, but they certainly knew how to do luxury, and they had their own version of that. So they weren't ascetic by any means, and they don't seem to have been that worried about their election. Okay. And finally, the economic dominance of Northwest Europe, which is the Protestant parts of Europe, most historians would agree now has much more to do with historical and geographic factors than religious factors. I won't go into the various arguments around that.
It's half an hour, John.
Beauty. Okay. I hope we're on track. Let's see how we go. So there's another version of talking through what happened to Christianity in Europe with the rise of capitalism, in which the Protestant Reformation figures quite largely, which is this book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, written by R.H. Tawney, a British economic historian. He was a committed Christian, and he was a very committed Christian, and also committed to ending capitalism. It was his life's work, really. And so he was very interested in the question of the relationship between religion and the rise of capitalism. And again, this is another one of those books that's been often misunderstood. A lot of people think he was saying the same thing as Weber, and you'll hear people sometimes talk about the Weber-Tawney thesis as if they're saying the same thing. So folks, if you ever hear someone say that, then you'll do me a favor if you jump in and say, no, Weber and Tawney weren't saying the same thing. In fact, Tawney was largely refuting Weber's thesis when he wrote this. He wrote his work. So Tawney was actually in this work something a lot of people have missed. He was not actually trying to offer an explanation of the rise of capitalism at all, and certainly not a causal one. Actually, what he was really interested in was to explain how European Christianity abandoned its economic ethics to allow free rein to capitalism. To be more succinct, he was interested in a history of how capitalism changed Christianity. And that's because he thought Christianity should be leading the charge against capitalism. But if you're going to do that, you have to explain why it hasn't so far and what happened. And so that was his task as a historian. So he begins his story with medieval Christianity, and Tawney is very good on talking about medieval Christianity, both its highs and its lows. He acknowledges it was full of hypocrisy and vice, but he says it was also clear that we shouldn't be blinded by that. As some history versions of history tend to be, there was a lot of very good thinking and also good action going on in within medieval Christianity's world that we need to pay attention to. And most importantly, we need to pay attention to their conceptions of economic ethics and how they conceived of vice and virtue in the economic world, because they wrote about these things a lot and they played a big part in how Christianity was thought about. So within medieval Christianity, religion was something that embraced all of life, and this was thus, for everyone agreed, something that should be determinative of economic ethics. The idea of there being some sort of separation between economic life and religion didn't make sense to them. And the pillars of medieval economic ethics were the theory of just price. So medieval scholars did a lot of thinking about how markets behaved and what a fair price for a product should be and how you determine such a price. And also the prohibition of usury. That's the ban on charging interest on loans. So that ban that the Jewish people were known for was actually maintained within the Christian world right up until the time of the Reformation. So these were their two core planks. And also very central to within medieval Christianity was a pretty widespread condemnation of avarice or greed. And therefore merchants were tended to be seen not lauded, as in our time, as really the most virtuous people in the culture, but often seen with suspicion. Then comes along Luther, and he breaks apart medieval Christianity with the Reformation. However, Luther didn't really change much in terms of economic ethics. His economic ethics were pretty much the same of those of medieval Christianity, and a conservative version of that. And Luther detested commercial civilization. He was much happier in a feudal world. But Calvin comes along, and Calvin grew up in a commercial world and in an urban setting, and he accepted commercial civilization. He didn't demonize it. But he also demanded quite strict moral discipline from people involved in commercial life. When we move across to England, which is Tawney's key interest point, we find that for the first part of the 16th century, after the Reformation, for the first period, the Church of England was actually surprisingly active in its resistance to capitalism, and often quite popular in how it opposed what was then agrarian capitalism, so happened in the agricultural landscape. So things like enclosures and rack renting. And the Church of England took quite, particularly in the late 16th century and early 17th century during the reign of the Stuart kings. However, concerted though the actions of the church were, Tawney thinks that their actions and their ethics were a bit too crude, and they weren't really adequate to the complexity of the changing economic times, which were changing very quickly. And he basically, in one sense, although he admires the vigor of their action against capitalism, he says that the church itself stopped to think, and therefore they no longer deserve to be listened to, because they weren't really thinking hard about the changing times. But really, moving into the 17th century, that is the 1600s in England, it was Puritanism that was the driving force of change. So this is really Calvinism, the form it took in England. And the 17th century was a time of a lot of trouble in English political life. And so Tawney notes there were two rival tendencies within English Puritanism, that is Calvinism. On the one hand, there was actually what we would call a collectivism, a strong collectivism, an idea that we are part of a community and we need to respond collectively to a community. And alongside of that went a very strong sense of economic discipline. We should discipline our economic lives to pay attention to how it affects the broader community. But on the other side, there is also this other strand, dynamic within Puritanism, of what he calls a spiritual individualism, this very keen focus on the state of my soul, on the state of my salvation, my relationship with God, as well as that went hand in hand with an embrace of commercial life. So the question is how these two sort of competing tendencies that you could find within the same person, how these would play out over the century. And the short story is, over the course of the century, over 100 years, it was the second tendency that won out by the time we get to the 18th century. And the key factor in that, driving that, was really the amount of conflict around religion that happened in England at the time, and the English Civil War, which was really bitter and brutal, was a major event there. And by the end of the century, basically people were exhausted from religious conflict and looking for a way of getting religion out of public life. And so some of the high idealism of earlier Calvinism in relation to economic ideas around collectivism was tended to be abandoned. By the end of the 18th century, what you see within English Puritanism was a transmission, a change from rather thinking about Christian discipleship, as we might think about it, focused on Christ, to thinking a lot about the role of providence. That is the idea that God has constructed the universe, the world, in such a way that things seem to go well according to a certain structure and what they were interested. Society seems to behave more like some sort of mechanism, and that's the idea that you actually see coming in Isaac Newton's at the end of the 17th century, his idea of God as the watchmaker. He basically winds things up, winds up the cosmos, and then lets it go. And it's also the idea you see happening present in Adam Smith's work in the 18th century. You have this continuing very strong sense of the pursuit of calling and vocation as a sign of holiness, how you measured your religiousness. And so that is pursuing your worldly vocation was a way of demonstrating your religiousness. And what you also see by the beginning of the 18th century is a much harsher attitude to poverty. Early in the century, there was a recognition that poverty was a social ill. If there was poverty, then that was because something was going wrong within society. By the end of the century, it was seen as a moral ill. If you were poor, there was something wrong with you. And so really what you have in Puritanism was an emphasis on individual responsibility and not social obligation. So here's some quotes from Tawney, summing it up. Puritanism, this is by the 18th century, enthroned religion in the privacy of the individual soul, not without some sober size of satisfaction at its abdication from society. What was Christian in Christianity had largely disappeared. God had been thrust into the frigid altitudes of infinite space. There was a limited monarchy in heaven as well upon the earth. Providence was the spectator of a curious machine which it had constructed and set in motion, but the operation of which it was neither able nor willing to control. And what Tawney's talking about there is the idea of the economy as a machine, and God has set up this machine, and you just have to let it run. You have to pay attention to its economic laws because they're divine laws. This is a new idea, and it's Tawney describes it well as being in the frigid altitudes of space. He goes on that the spiritual blindness which made possible the general acquiescence in the horrors of the early factory system of the Industrial Revolution was not a novelty, but it was actually the habit of a century. So by the time we get to the Industrial Revolution and we have Christian people not paying much attention to all the horrible things going on there, Jacob and I have done a couple of podcasts on that recently, they're all already practiced at ignoring this stuff. So the end point of Tawney's ideas is that Christianity did not cause capitalism. Rather, Christianity's abandonment of its own ethics allowed capitalism to become dominant. He saw the task of Christianity in his time, and we could take that into our time, is to reclaim its ethics and ultimately to overthrow capitalism. We're going to revisit this idea once we come to think about Christian witness in our time. Here's a quote from Tawney. He was a strong writer. He's very quotable. Compromise is impossible between the Church of Christ and the idolatry of wealth, which is the practical religion of capitalist societies, as it was between the church and the state idolatry of the Roman Empire. All right. We have hit time, and I think I'm going to stop there. So I had some more I could say, but I think I should abide by our structure and stop and see how we're going. And let's take questions.
Yeah, so as before, you can either unmute and ask, you can put your Zoom hand up, or hopefully I'll see you if you put your real hand up, or you can post questions in the chat. You can indicate if you'd like me to ask them as well, if you prefer not to speak. But we don't have any questions in the chat as is, so it's first come, first serve right now.
Sure. And Jacob, you shared some of the links on the article.
Yeah, that's right. So I can keep sharing some more of those ones.
Yeah.
We've got the Religion and the Rise of Capitalism ones. Here's the podcast that John and I did recently on Industrial Revolution. That's part 1.
Any questions then?
I'll start with a statement, Jonathan. That's the most times I've heard ism in 45 minutes.
Sorry. It's hard to say. I must imagine I must speak to listen to as well.
I found helpful. I think some of the framing you gave in the first session of that, many of these are things that with distance we look back and observe, and then we sort of just put ism on the end of whatever we want. I've got that. So, strange question. Capitalism and individualism, just towards the end of what you're saying tonight, started like maybe the most closely related of all the isms, which started, but there's corporate greed and collective, you have tens of thousands of shareholders, so it's not, I don't know, there's no question there, but if you want to speak to that, just that's my recent thought.
No, I think that's I think I pick up on what you're saying. Very I think that's very Brendan. So basically, if you notice at the end, then one of the things that Tawney saw as one of the things that led to Christianity sort of losing its sight of its economic ethics was the spiritual, what he described as the spiritual individualism that came. So this was one of the legacies of the Protestant Reformation. He wasn't totally down on Protestant Reformation, by the way. He also saw there were good things that came out of it as well. But this was one of the unintended legacies, was this basically spiritual individualism. And he says it's a true element of Christianity, because the idea of the relationship of the individual to God is actually one of the great gifts of the Protestant Reformation, to back to the world, to say, actually, this doesn't just have to be through a priest. You can have a direct access to God. And that's, this is, but as Tawney said, sometimes our eyes are blinded by too much light. And this idea of the personal relationship to God came to dominate and blot out all else. So you see that then, so that takes on a spiritual quality, but then through the 18th century, as what you actually have is a waning of essentially of Christian faith. So Christian faith becomes much more idea-based. So these ideas of providence are really big. And then, but you have these ideas around the individual sort of secularizing in a similar way that Weber talked about. You have a religious idea, and then over the long play of time, it sort of secularizes into a culture and transmits into our general individualism. So what you really have seeing born in the 18th and 19th century is how we would think about what we would call liberal individualism. The idea that as an individual, I should just be free to do whatever I like. There should be as few constraints upon me as possible. The role of government is to ensure my maximum liberty and freedom as an individual to do what I like. And that has been central to the Western expression of capitalism. That has been central to how it's unfolded. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the only way that capitalism can happen. It can happen in collective forms as well, but it's really, I think, in Western individualist capitalism, it's taken on real steroids, and that's been one of its secret sources, if you like. So there is a very strong link between, and they become reinforcing, because the whole, so the more you take on a capitalist rationality, it's about self, depending how you're defining who you're gaining profit for. But then you're reinforcing the self, and so you're losing sight of ultimate end beyond yourself.
All right. Hey, so you presented Weber, whatever it is, not Weber, and then said he's been shot down. Then you presented Tawney. It didn't tell us in the end. Do you agree with Tawney? Is that what you think is the best explanation?
So I think he provides a much better history of what happened to Christianity. So yes, I do agree, largely with the outline of Tawney's version of it. I think there's more that you can say, so that's not the full picture. And as I said, he's actually really in that describing what happened to Christianity. He's not offering a cause for capitalism. And he probably sees the causes as being more economic, actually. His causes are also would be quite similar to the list in the first session of the perfect storm of changes that happened within Europe, combining. So yeah, the short answer is I think his version of history of what happened is a much better accounting of what happened than Weber's, I don't think his history has been refuted yet, as Weber's has, his version.
Naomi, would you like to ask your question, or do you want me to ask?
Well, I can ask it. I was just wondering about the connection between capitalism and consumerism, and how they're defined differently, but also the relationship both historically and how they play out, because they seem very connected.
Sure, absolutely. So really, consumerism is something that is birthed as we know it within capitalism. So it's it's really the outworking of that dynamic of, I talk about capitalism being driven towards a relentless commodification that's bringing things in, more and more things into the realm of the market to expand the realm of the market, which expands the realm of profit making. So if you think one of the key ways to do that is to increasingly expand the range that create a mass market. So you see that happening in the 18th century and the 19th century in England, the beginning of mass market, and that really take on steroids in the 20th century. That all happens within a capitalist economic system. So consumerism is an outworking of capitalism. It's not necessary. You might say, from the perspective of us down below, who aren't necessarily capitalists out there seeking to make profit, but we are consumerists, people who are caught up in this cycle of consumption, that were the fodder for capitalism, if you like. But you could also argue that we get, the more that we are, we also perhaps, well, some of it at least get trained in the methods of capitalism. So if you look particularly in Australia since the 1990s, the idea that you are an enterprise in yourself, and that if you want to get on in the world, you've got to make the most of your brand. You want to invest. So you might have a job, but if you get some spare money, then you want to start real estate investing. You want to, if you're thinking about your career, then you're really building up a brand, and you want to be able to sell that and advertise that brand and think it in terms of what you can attract. So, and that's really what we're describing there, is being schooled in the techniques of capitalism, and that the sort of the gateway drug, if you like, was consumerism. Perhaps I just made that up, but I think that sort of works.
Do you know where Tawney's name comes from, John? There's a little question whether it might be related to Tawney Port.
Oh, well,
I don't know which way.
No, I'm pretty sure his name came from his dad, but I have no idea. No, sorry.
I'll ask another one if you haven't,
Yeah, go for it.
So you talked about, get it right. The English Civil War, everyone was exhausted by the end of it, and it was all over religion. Well, all over, that was major. So then people sort of said, look, we've had enough of religion. It will sink religion back to personal faith and have effectively a secular state.
Yes.
And my understanding is that's not true just of England, but in entire Europe, where all the intense wars that went on through the sort of 15th, 16th century. And
again,
basically,
the 17th century was the key point in mainland Europe. So the 30 Years' War happened about the same time, in Europe.
Yeah. So people have, and the other comment I've heard is, when Jesus responds about taxes in the gospel, where he says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. I've heard an argument that that's sort of setting up this divide between the religious and secular. So effectively people, so I think what I'm understanding is your argument is that that Christians wanted a nation state that was not religious, to get rid of all these religious wars, arguing over whether your baptism was right or mine was wrong, or.
Yes, so they wanted to get rid of, I guess, so in England, so let's keep it to England because it does get a bit more complicated, of this idea of sectarianism. So the idea of toleration comes in, so that being tolerant of other religions. What they meant were other forms of Protestantism. They were not tolerant of Catholicism. So that was well into the 1900s that they started to loosen up the shackles on Catholics. The idea of being tolerant meant that you could practice your religion, your version of Protestantism, and we'll tolerate that. We won't put too many bars against you. So and that develops. I mean, basically that increases as you go through the 18th century into the 19th century, and things just become increasingly more liberal, the literal meaning of liberal, free, in terms of those sorts of things. Now, I've lost track of the actual question.
Well, sort of, if this is the argument that effectively doing that allowed capitalism to arise, because is that correct, my understanding?
I think so. What the argument is more that, so what happened with that move, so you have a few things. I didn't perhaps give the full version of it. You have a few. So one, you have the moral authority of the church as an institution. It becomes completely shattered because you have all these different groups, and also the church has been implicated in so much conflict. So the idea that the church, as in medieval times, could be something that makes pronouncements on usury and actually have its own courts that could charge you take you to court for being a usurer, as happened in the early Church of England. They had church courts that would take people to court for either usury or for enclosure. The idea that the church could continue to do this was no longer tolerated. The church just has to get out of things. Because what we, religion is about us as individuals, this spiritual individualism. The church has lost its moral authority. It can't really tell us what to do. God has set up this economic machine that we call providence, and that's the divine law we need to obey. So these are all things that are coming together, and basically the idea that what you have by the beginning of the 18th century that Christianity really had anything to say of meaning about economic life, that it could really input anything. So to sum it up, where things had got to in England by this stage was Christianity, the church particularly, should just shut up and butt out. It's what it should talk about is your soul and how you're going to get to heaven. Everyone agreed on that. So they didn't want them to stop talking about that. They should just focus on that. But, interest rates and trade and just prices, that's not the realm of the church. So this is the new world. So in the medieval times, these were fundamentally seen as a concern of the church. And by the time we get to the 18th century, everyone agrees, what's the church talking about this stuff? That's the world we live in. That seems out, why would the church talk about interest rates?
Yet this anti-slavery movement was a church, or wasn't it? So
that's the beginning of the abolitionist movement is really the early echoes of some sort of return. So it begins piecemeal. It's a very specific return of a social conscience around economic stuff. So interestingly enough, William Wilberforce, who was at the head of the anti-slavery movement and saw that so clearly, actually opposed many of the factory acts to start with, because he said actually that the government shouldn't be regulating what happens in factories. These are places of freedom of contract. We're only interested in slavery, because slavery is bad, but what they're doing in the factories in England, well, we've got nothing to say about that, because in theory there's freedom of contract. So you can even see with Wilberforce's, he's still, although you see something starting to come back, and it comes back through the 19th century. And it's actually, so you have within the Church of England through the course of the 19th century, a reawakening of what we might call a real Christian economic conscience. And Tawney is the inheritor of that, actually. So he's really very much within that movement. So, and it never went away 100%. Charles Wesley had a social conscience. So, but when we're generalizing about the bigger picture, that's a fairly true statement. So, does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, no, that's good.
Can I ask then? Sorry. When did the prohibition on usury within Christianity, did that, how long did it take for that process to happen? And was it in certain places first, or at certain times, or certain trigger points? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, very good question. And I'm not really competent to give you a good answer in that, Claire, other than to say it happened piecemeal at different places at different times. So a very different patchwork for how things played out from in, say, Germany or Austria and Italy and France and England. So they all, and obviously the Catholic, those countries that stayed Catholic, things happened differently, but ultimately still happened there as well. But yeah, it's a bit of a patchwork story, I think.
I should also say that if you got the slides for tonight, there's a lot of links that I've been posting throughout the evening, right at the end of those slides, in case you don't want to track down every link individually.
Sure. Now, also in those slides, you'll find a bunch of slides which I didn't get to tonight, which go on a bit further beyond Weber and Tawney to some of my own speculations around some things. But I don't know if they'll make much sense. But so my own version, just to give you to interpret those slides, if you have a look at them, if you really want to look at where the big this consequential changes happened that allowed the sorts of changes that Tawney was so worried about. You have to go all the way back to what you might call the Constantinian shift, way back in early Christianity in the 4th century, when Constantine became the first Christian emperor of Rome, and a whole bunch of things changed in Christianity then, or began to change and sort of had to change to allow that change, that set up dynamics that would then play out come the Reformation, how they did with capitalism. And Tawney actually, I think, already saw some of that. He didn't develop it fully. He saw bits of that picture. And so I give a version of those events. Yeah, plus other stuff, but we won't go there tonight.
We've done 3 podcasts on the Constantinian shift as well, if you're really keen. It's like
Yes.
pretty much 3 hours of discussion on it.
Yeah, so if you want to know about the Constantinian shift, hopefully that, if we didn't get it in 3 podcasts, it's not worth saying.
Any other questions, even from previous weeks, or clarifications as well? Like, there's a lot to take in. I know I'm still digesting a lot of it, so don't feel shy about asking for further detail or specification.
If not, there's no reason why we can't finish early tonight.
I have a question. It's Kim here. That Paul and asked you about the connection with people saying that the Jesus, gives Caesar what is Caesar's. How does that, obviously that's way before the most of the history you're talking about. So how do we interpret that with the things that you're talking about? Is there any connection?
Oh, gee, that's going to strain my brain. What's the connection when Jesus says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's? So in the Gospels, that's a question about tax and how they relate to they're challenging about how they should relate to the Roman Empire. That's where the trap lies for Jesus in the question. And actually, I think Jesus' response is very enigmatic. So when he says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's, well, you have to think, well, what rightly is Caesar's and what rightly is God's? So they become very big questions. And you can you can populate your answers quite differently in relation to that. And I've heard very different versions. I've heard biblical scholars say that Jesus was categorically saying you should pay the tax, and others saying he was categorically saying don't pay the tax, and everything in between. I don't think it has too much to bear on our topic for tonight, other than it has to do with the relationship between Christianity and the dominant structures around it, right? And this is so how does Christianity relate to, in this case, the Roman Empire and to the big power structures? And Jesus is charting a careful path. He's basically saying that Caesar does deserve some things. And if you go into Paul's theology in Romans 13, Paul basically says, political authority is ordained by God. It's a providential structure. So there's a place for that, but then the question is, what belongs to God is, well, if we pay attention to New Testament theology and Jesus' teaching, then, well, that's all of life belongs to God, even that which is Caesar's. I'm just talking off the top of my head now. I don't even know where I'm going. But essentially, what we're prompted to do is to think about as Christianities how we relate to these big power structures, and that's the task of what we're doing through these whole process. So that's what the early Christians had to do. How did they relate to Caesar? So one, they gave him the authority that he was due, but they wouldn't sacrifice to him. He was not due that worship. So Caesar was not due the worship, and Christians paid the price for that. So that's an example. Yeah. if I think of a better answer later on, I'll maybe mention it next time we gather.
I will keep adding to it. So the point of that is, I think, and I may have it wrong, but you know, Tom Holland wrote that book Dominion that everyone got around reading. But I think somewhere in there he argues this is the origin of the separation of church and state, that all empires prior to that, effectively the religious structure supported the emperor, the king, and the king was an absolute authority. And that perhaps is a question you're perhaps going to answer in the future, but we've developed this concept, which you partly described, of having a secular state. And it gets promoted as Europe's expanded around the world. And it's actually served Christianity well in a lot of ways, because a secular state allows freedom of religion and hence missionaries to be active. But a secular state, therefore, well, it's secular, so it's not.
So here we have to make some. So yeah, this is a really important distinction, Paul. So there, so key difference. We need to make a distinction between the difference between there being some divide between religion and politics, or religion and economics, which basically I would argue, and the medieval church certainly argued, there could be no such thing. All of political life has religious meaning. You can't divide it. The difference between that statement and the difference, this separation between church and state, two forms of institution, so different. So with the separation between church and state, I'm not sure if I would agree with Tom Holland that going back to the being able to trace that to the teaching of Jesus about render unto Caesar. However, it's certainly instituted within early Christianity once you get to thinkers like Augustine and the early popes thinking about what it meant to have a Christian emperor. And they're basically talking about a division between the, you know, this is the state's task and this is the church's task. And that gets framed in different ways through medieval Christianity. But there is this recognition that they're two distinct things. And that is, I think, critical to Christianity and has been critical to Christian political understanding, and should be so, the separation between church and state. But that's very different from saying that religion and politics have to be kept separate, because what you're basically saying is what happens in political life isn't informed by ultimate meaning, which is there's very few religions in the world or that could accept that statement, really. So I'm not sure what the question was, but I think those are important distinctions to make. So we can support a secular state and the church not being part of that, but without having to say that religion has no place in politics. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. But it's perhaps does the church simply then have a voice into this secular state and an influence as distinct to a ability to control?
Absolutely, yes. So, and that's the idea of a separation, is that that the church shouldn't be able to control certain sorts of things, and that was the idea from the beginning in early Christian times when they came up with those ideas, that it's the state's responsibility to take care of this set of stuff, and the church's, but it doesn't mean the church doesn't have anything to say about those things. So criminal justice, for example, it's not the church's place to be instituting criminal justice. That's the state's role. But the church has something to say about those. In the end, that the state has to make the decision, and it's not the church's role to start its own criminal justice system, for example. I hope that makes a distinction clear.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's, so you go back to your example of usury, you're sort of saying, well, the state comes along and says, no, actually, we want an economic system where we're going to have interest. The church can try and be a voice against that. although it sounds like the church perhaps gave up being a voice against that.
Pretty much, yes.
But it may have to accept that, in fact, it's only a voice and it's not going to be listened to.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, and I think so. So we're getting into the realm of political theology here in it now. So that's a little bit beyond our remit, but I think that's, so basically, I think that's the best Christian political theology affirms that the church shouldn't have secular power. And whether it's an influential voice in society or not, so whether if you're in a Christian culture where the church still has moral authority, well, that means, well, great, the church may have significant influence on things. But as in our context, it may be a complete minority voice, in which case, if the church is going to participate in the political realm and has a lot of other forces arrayed hostile to it, then it has to think very carefully about how it thinks about being involved in the political realm. And I would argue that's actually our context now.
Food for thought, John.
Yes.
Can I
I think
ask a different
go
question?
We do. So this is finishing up time. So I'm happy to keep going, but feel free to drop off if you need to. Go ahead, Anne.
I was interested in the century you were talking about, where at the beginning of the century, poverty was seen as a society problem. And by the end of it, it was the problem of the individual.
Yes.
And I wasn't sure quite how that happened.
Yeah, so I mean, that's basically cutting a long story short. And that has a lot to do with that. So, and that was particularly within Puritanism. So this idea that Puritanism, it had these couple of strands within it in its original DNA. So this sense of collectivism, which is we might call it social justice within it. So to in early Puritanism, which so in some aspects of, there were groups during the English Civil War who really we would call them almost communist in terms of their economic views. They wanted levels of economic sharing and so on. And that was the way that their Puritanism expressed itself. By the time you get to the end of the century, those people, one, they sort of lost out politically. But two, there's been so much conflict, and there's been, what has won out within Puritanism is the individualist strand within it. This idea that, what really matters is what we would call the spiritualization, the privatization of faith, and that's what happened. And therefore, and the way that they thought about morality was in terms of virtues, were being hardworking, doing well, all these sorts of things. Therefore, if you were poor and you weren't doing well, that sort of meant you weren't virtuous. It's the sort of flip side. To be poor was the flip side of not being virtuous. So the way they set up virtue basically set up poverty to be called a vice, which was a moral vice, and it must be your fault. And they'd also lost sight of by losing their sense of social justice, they weren't really paying attention to how people might be being kicked off their land by landowners, or other things happening. They were really looking at only at individuals. They weren't looking at society. So they stopped looking at a bigger picture.